Hello everybody and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. In today's video we'll look at the question how to make the right choice between REST and GraphQL. The idea is to look a little bit at the background of GraphQL, where it came from, and then I will give you 4 specific things that you can look at to better understand how to make the choice between REST and GraphQL. The way we structure this video is we will first have a brief look at the history of GraphQL and why it's important to know about this history and how this can help you to make your choice as an informed choice. And then we'll walk through those 4 different things that you can look at to figure out, should I use REST or should I use GraphQL? Before we dive into the history of GraphQL, a very brief crash course around APIs. What are APIs? APIs are the connective fabric of modern IT. They are the way how components in a modern IT architecture interface. So they are the interface between software components. And if you take this to its logical conclusion, you end up with an approach that's called API first, meaning that every component has an API and only talks to other components through their APIs. And if you do it this way, then you can very clearly see how important APIs become, because they are the one connecting factor between all of your IT components, which means that it's really important to think about how you design them, how you make it easy to use them, how you make it easy to find them. And you want to help all of your teams in your organizations to do that so that they can use API in the most productive way. APIs also are an important factor when it comes to microservices, which is a specific pattern around how to build software components. And in microservices, what matters most is that each component that you build has one specific purpose, and you build it as an individual component that is individually deployable. And that means that you can change that component more easily. You can scale things more easily because you can scale individual components. And that is a pattern that a lot of organizations are really interested in, because in more traditional, more integrated architectures, this often causes problems. When we look at this very brief introduction into APIs, what we see is that it's really important to get APIs right, because they will be a limiting factor when you want to scale up your IT landscape and you want to make sure that everything can be connected as easily as possible, and also things can be changed as easily as possible. Now let's move forward and look at an example of APIs in action, and of course we'll use the example where GraphQL originated, which is the story of Facebook. Facebook is a large organization. They have a lot of IT in place, of course, but the specific place that we want to look at is the way how Facebook user interfaces, which can be on your phone, on your tablet, on your computer, in your web browser, how these user interfaces talk to the Facebook backend. That's an API, and the question is how that happens. What Facebook figured out when they first did that was that the way how they had initially designed their APIs meant that these components had issues, they had problems. And these problems were caused by the fact that the social graph of Facebook is really large, because there is, I think by now, 1.5 billion people in that graph, and they all have many posts, and these posts have many likes. And these are all interconnected data structures that a client needs to access. The way this was initially designed was to go through RESTful web services, which meant that you had a lot of interactions saying, give me the information about the user. Now give me the information about the user's newsfeed. Now give me all the information about the likes for that newsfeed, for the posts in that newsfeed. So that meant a lot of back and forth between clients and the API, which slowed the clients down. The problem that was observed was the APIs that were used were chatty, and it was also happening, what was also happening was something that's called overfetching, meaning that in many cases the clients would get too much information because the responses always contained relatively complete result sets, and then smaller clients, let's say on a phone, would throw away certain information that they wouldn't need, because on a phone you typically have smaller screen space, so you throw away some information, meaning that you were transmitting information to the client that they didn't need. How can you fix that? There are probably three major things what you could do. One thing would be to make your REST resources a little bit more powerful, to allow clients to say, I only want 5 of those posts, and I only want those fields in those posts. That would mean that you would have to specifically design all those REST services in a way that allows kind of filtering and specifically selecting fields of them. That would have been one solution to go. Another one would have been to say we build specific backends for each front end, meaning that you would have an API for the phone services, for the phone interfaces, and you would have an API for the tablet interfaces, and you would have an API for the back interface. That would probably cause problems keeping those APIs in sync, because they should all do the same things, just in slightly different variations. So maybe that would not be the best solution, but definitely Facebook didn't go with that. And the third way how you could approach that would be the idea of changing the API style, and instead of interacting with these resources and say, give me all the posts, give me all the likes for the posts, give me all the user information for the user that created that like, you would actually treat all of this as a graph, the social graph, and then you would have a query feature where clients could specifically say, I want to have this part of the graph. This is the way that Facebook went. And this is what we have nowadays as GraphQL. What's interesting as a side note, if you're interested a little bit more in these general design questions of how do you even pick how you design APIs, is that Facebook went from one style, the REST style, to another style, the query style. If you want to learn more about API styles, feel free to watch this video about API styles. It'll walk you through the styles that exist and what they are good at and how they work. Briefly looking at the ones that are relevant here, the resource style really means that you have these different interactions with all your resources, meaning that you have more interactions. That can be a disadvantage, but it is a logical result of saying I model my API, so to speak, as this set of resources, and clients interact with those resources. And then if you need a lot of information, you need several calls to get to this information. The model that a query-based style looks at is a little different. The query style is, instead of having all these different resources, you have one API endpoint that you interact with. You submit a query to that endpoint, and then you have on the server side an engine that runs the query, compiles the data for you, and returns exactly what you were asking for. So that means that on the server side, you now have more logic, so to speak, or you have a different kind of logic that allows to very specifically assemble the response exactly as the client has asked for. And the way that Facebook went about making this move from RESTful APIs to query APIs was they invented their own language. They came up with GraphQL. GraphQL is a query-oriented API language. It is now something that a lot of people are interested in because it is different and it has certain properties that REST doesn't have. It is used over HTTP in the same way as REST is often used over HTTP, but it's different in the sense that you only interact with that single API endpoint, which is then processing your query and returns what you were asking for. This means that the main focus of GraphQL is this data model that you query into, because that is basically what GraphQL does. You have a potentially complex data model, and a client issues a query into that data model and gets a response based on that data model. Here's a very simple example of how that looks like. If you look at the top half of this window, what you will see is what a request looks like. This is a cute little interactive graphic that has actually been created by the GraphQL Foundation. And if you look at the bottom half of the window, you will see what the response looks like. So what you can see is that you can type your request in JSON-inspired way, and then your response will actually be JSON that is returned to you that contains the fields that you are asking for. In reality, the requests and the responses often look quite a bit more complex, but this is good enough to give you an idea of what GraphQL can do. When you look at GraphQL, how it originated, I think it is important to know and to consider that Facebook created GraphQL to improve the way how their clients communicate with their backend. Even today, when you look at how Facebook uses GraphQL, they use it only for the communication between their clients and their backend. There is a public API that Facebook has that you can use, everybody can use, but this API, interestingly, does not use GraphQL. This API is using REST. You can speculate in many ways why that is the case, but I think it is an interesting thing to observe that even the creator of GraphQL did not radically change all their APIs to GraphQL and said, oh, this is the best thing that you can use for any API. They very specifically are using it for the scenario they designed it for. And what's interesting about this scenario where they use it is really that it's a scenario where Facebook controls all the parts in it. Facebook controls the clients. They can release new clients when they want to, and Facebook controls, of course, the backend, which means that whenever they make any changes, they can easily control how these changes affect these components, when they update these components, which makes things much easier than in scenarios where you would have clients that you don't control, meaning that when you make changes, you have to consider how this will affect consumers that you have no control over. Now let's look at those 4 interesting considerations that you can go through when you think about whether you should expose your API through REST or through GraphQL. And I think it really is something that is important to do because, as very often people are saying, and I think it's a good consideration to keep in mind always as a general consideration, once you've released an API, it's really hard to take it back. Because in the end, your API only makes sense when it is consumed. So you want many consumers. But many consumers also means many dependencies. And that means when you make changes, then you have to be aware of those dependencies. You hopefully try to treat those responsibly, meaning that you now have kind of a problem in front of you if you make any changes that would break some of these consumers. So it is an important thing to think about which way to go when you start considering exposing an API from the component that you're working on. Now let's walk through those 4 different considerations that help you to determine whether you should use REST or GraphQL. The first one is your API landscape. What do we mean by API landscape? An API landscape, in particular in bigger organizations, can be large and complex. It's the entirety of all the APIs that exist in an organization that expose features that are made available by some software component. And in large organizations, these are hundreds, often thousands, often many thousands of APIs that are available. And then the question is, how do you expose all of this? The most radical notion would be to say, well, we just have one GraphQL endpoint for everything. And sometimes people are even thinking about how they could do that. While that sounds maybe tempting, it is important to keep in mind that in many cases, all the problems, or let's say many of the problems of enterprise IT that we've looked at over the past decades, they come from the idea of building a system, integrating everything in one thing that you can conveniently manage, test, deploy, secure, whatever it is that you want to do with it. This drive to try to build a system, it's easy to understand, but it has a lot of side effects. And interestingly, most organizations nowadays try to move away from this and to go from building systems to cultivating ecosystems, meaning that instead of trying to have everything integrated, you try to have parts that are autonomous, that are still governed by whatever you need to make them secure, to scale them, to discover them, all the things that you want for your IT to have as properties, but without creating all the side effects that are created by centralization and integration. GraphQL kind of walks an edge here. And the question always is, if you build a GraphQL API, how many things, so to speak, do you hide behind that API? The more things you hide, the harder it will become to evolve that API, to operate it in a resilient way, and to make sure that over time, this API doesn't become a bottleneck when you want to change things and you want to change the way how your IT landscape works and can adapt to, for example, changing ways how your business wants to operate. So it's really important to think how the API that you're about to expose would fit into that landscape. What we see in large organizations is that in most cases, they go the way of having relatively small APIs, back to the microservices that I was mentioning earlier, and then exposing those APIs in RESTful ways and not kind of integrating, so to speak, many of those under one GraphQL endpoint. You can do that, but at least think about what you're doing, which pattern you're following, and whether that is something that not only is maybe an interesting thing to do for now, but also what kind of long-term implications that will have. I think that really is the most important point here. Think about how viable what you're doing is over time in a changing environment with changing constraints coming from the environment itself and what the business side actually wants to do. So this is our first consideration. The second one is, what is the core, so to speak, of your API? Is it more data or is it workflows? This is not really a strict distinction between those two things. But GraphQL definitely works better when you think more about data, meaning that the data that you have is exposed as a graph, and you can query into this graph and you get back that part of the graph that you were asking for. So that's nice. Workflows, on the other hand, often are more process-oriented. Let's think of an example such as shopping. So a shopping process would say you ask for certain products, then you collect the ones that you want to buy, then you pay for them, then you have to say where they have to be shipped. Maybe you also have to figure out what kind of shipping options there are. You will have back and forth conversations around, well, if you pick this option, it will take this long and it will be this expensive. So there's a lot of things that are not just queries into data, but it's a process going back and forth where the conversation centers around those data pieces going back and forth, the messages being exchanged, and it's not so much somebody just asking about what kind of data do you have. It's more like, if I ship it with this carrier to this zip code, how much will it cost and how long will it take? If you have APIs such as this, which are more process-oriented, then in many cases REST is a better fit, because that's pretty much the model that REST has been built around. If you have more data-oriented APIs that work more with the assumption that what you're exposing through your API is more data than providing access to a process, then GraphQL might be a good choice here. Let's move on to our third point. The third point is saying that whenever you build an API, the number one goal of each API is to be consumed. Building an API that is not consumed doesn't make any sense. And in order to be consumed, you have to listen to your consumers, or you have to at least try to do what you think will be good for your consumers. Sometimes, of course, you cannot listen to your consumers because you don't know who they will be, but you can make assumptions, and you should make assumptions and say, I think that this would be a good design for these consumers for these reasons. And this is an important exercise to go through. You can call it design thinking, you can call it other things, but not just saying, I'm having something, I'm exposing it in whichever way I please, and then people will have to deal with it. People may, or people may not. And the more you think about what the preferences of those people might be, the more you have a good chance of having an API where people will look at it and say, oh, that looks nice, that's well designed, I understand it, it's easy to use, it's easy to understand, so that's a pleasant developer experience to use it. And depending on what you expose, again, this may end up with different conclusions. The prototypical scenario of GraphQL is that you have a user interface in apps or in a browser talking to a backend. And this is where GraphQL often can be useful. You could also do it with REST, of course, but that's at least the one scenario that GraphQL has been designed for. So in that case, if you have these kinds of consumers, user interfaces, then maybe that's an interesting thing to look at. Another thing that might also play into this, there's different kinds of tooling around those two approaches. And one interesting thing that GraphQL users really like is this tool called GraphQL. And GraphQL is a tool that allows you to interactively explore a GraphQL endpoint. It will look at the schema, it will allow you to build queries, and you can run those queries and see what you get as a result, and the response will be informed by the schema and tell you, well, you should have typed this and not that. So it's something where it's useful if you want others to allow to experiment and learn with your API. And that's something that also is good for developer experience. So depending on which one you pick, GraphQL or REST, you end up with different kinds of experiences. One thing that we also see definitely is a little bit of the hype curve, right? So nowadays GraphQL, it's not really new anymore, but it's still the younger one of those technologies. So sometimes I think you also see people just picking it because, well, it's the new kid on the block. So if you want to show that we're ahead of the curve, then we'll pick this over the older one. And that can also be something where you say, well, that might be appealing to my consumers, to developers. So that actually is a valid consideration to make, as long as it's also a technically sound decision. I think that's important to keep in mind. That was our third point. Now let's move on to our fourth one. The fourth one is that I think it's also really important to avoid taking shortcuts. What do I mean by this? The shortcut that you can see quite a bit is that GraphQL exposes a schema and allows you to interact with what you could say is a JSON-like backend. It's a little different because it's a graph and JSON doesn't do graphs, but what you get back is JSON. So it's tempting to look at what you have in your service, in your software, in your implementation, and maybe some JSON version of it, and directly expose that. And that, I think, is problematic, because in the end, each API should be designed. It should not be just exposing its implementation through the interface, but instead, a well-designed API should always be designed outside in, meaning that you start thinking from the consumers, what would they expect? And then you design the structures, the interactions around those assumptions. And then you start implementing it. And then you start in most cases, mapping those outside-in designs into whatever you have implemented in your database and your code. Don't skip that step. GraphQL, I think, has a little bit of the potential to make you skip this step, because you might have some JSON model and then you might be tempted to directly expose it. Try to not do that, or at least think hard before you are doing it, because once you do that, you're married to this model because it's in your API, and now when you want to change your implementation, suddenly your API changes, and that's not good. So don't take the shortcut, and make sure that regardless of what you choose, GraphQL or REST, design the API, design it properly, design it from the outside in, and then you will end up with an API that is well designed, regardless of whether it's GraphQL or REST. And I think that's the most important takeaway here. So that was our fourth and last point. I hope this gave you some input that allows you to think about what should I choose when I'm thinking about I want to have an API, which one should I choose? I could do REST, I could do GraphQL, what should I pick? And if you walk through those four considerations, I think it gives you a better background, a better foundation to make a good and informed choice. Keep in mind that all of this, I hope, has also made clear that there is no silver bullet. There is no way you can say it's always good to pick REST or it's always good to pick GraphQL. There are certain scenarios that probably are leaning more towards saying probably REST is a little bit of a better choice here, or maybe that's a good scenario for GraphQL. But there is no API that you could not design either way. So treat each API as a design exercise that you have to go through. That is important because APIs are important, as I said in the beginning. And make sure that you make the right choice. And when you are careful enough to think through those steps of what am I doing here and what is the best way for solving this particular problem that I'm facing right now, then I think you have a good chance of doing that. Just out of my own experience, what I see in the many organizations that I talk to is that GraphQL is not used for many things. And in the places where it is used, it's mostly used for private APIs. And even Facebook uses it only for a private API. The API that the Facebook backend exposes and that the Facebook clients are using is a private API. Nobody other than the Facebook clients can use that. So it's not an API that is made available to non-Facebook users. And that's a typical thing that you see with GraphQL. For other APIs, for partner and public APIs, and if you're interested in the differences between partner, public and private APIs, I had a little video a while ago that I think also will help you to think about the distinction a little bit. And in most cases, when it comes to partners and public, then people choose REST APIs. Some people say that's not good, or that's just old school and we should change all of this. But this is the reality of what happens in organizations right now. And I think that is at least an interesting data point to consider. And once again, because I think it really is the most important thing here, whenever you do have to make this choice between different ways how you can design something, always think about the consumer. Never think about what am I doing? Always think about who am I doing this for and what would work for them. That is the most important thing to take away here. Because in the end, when it comes to making the decision what to choose, it's mostly about how do you find the best possible way to deliver the product that you have, which is the component, the capability that you're implementing, to deliver that to consumers. And I have this little video that I made a while ago about the beer, where my example is saying that if you look at beer, the value is in the beer, and an API is just the delivery mechanism, meaning that the API is either the bottle or the can. So the main value that you will deliver to your customers anyway is not the API. The main value is the capability, of course. And you just have to make sure that your delivery mechanism, the API, the bottle, the can, that your delivery mechanism works for your consumers, that it works for the context where you are making this capability available. And when you think about it this way, I think you have a good conceptual image of how to make that decision. And I think then this will allow you to also make a good choice and to say, okay, we're going with REST or we're going with GraphQL for this API. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope you found that interesting. On this slide, you can find a link to the online version of the slides. If you're interested in an online version of the slides, you can find that at the URI shown here. If you follow that link, the slides are web-based. You can see them in your browser, and they're actually linked. So when you look at the slides, you can follow links and explore all the resources that I made available. Thanks again for watching. And if you're interested in more information about myself and the content that I'm producing, here are some links about me, my Twitter feed, my YouTube videos, and LinkedIn. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm always really interested to hear from people what they think about the content that I'm producing and how it works for them in real life. Thanks a lot and see you soon.